Final Fantasy XIV is an MMO that I'm sure everyone who clicked on this video has heard of. The MMO to finally take over WoW for a substantial amount of time and has tons of the biggest names on Twitch and YouTube supporting it and playing it for millions to see. Why is that now, almost a year since then, it feels like the game sort of faded back into its old position. Final Fantasy XIV doesn't really bring the traction it used to. Not as many big names talk about the game or play it on stream, mostly leaving it on people that have dedicated their streams to MMOs or even just Final Fantasy to keep the content creating community around it alive. What was the catalyst for this to happen? For content creators and players alike to lose interest and only really bring up the game when something big happens or something new, then promptly moving on to the next thing when it's over. Will Final Fantasy XIV move back into the front runner spot and be the biggest MMO in the gaming world again? Or will it stay in the middle ground of being a solid MMO but not groundbreaking in its appeal? I want to preface all of this by saying that I've played since Stormblood, so I'm not some hardened veteran that's seen Final Fantasy XIV from beginning to end, but I've been around long enough to see the game grow and transform from its second expansion onwards. I've also done some Savage raiding in that time, clearing all of Eden in the first tier of Pandemonium. I also tried Ultimate for some time, but let's not talk about that. All that to say, I'm not an outsider looking in or someone who's trying to talk about this for the sake of clickbait or whatever the case may be. I genuinely want to see this game do better and want to voice some opinions that may be unpopular to a lot of people that still play this game and genuinely enjoy it. Personally, I stopped playing after the regroup I was in cleared the first tier, honestly just feeling burnt out and frustrated with the game's path forward. So let's talk about it. Enough rambling. On to the hot takes, probably. The first thing I want to go over is probably the most important thing to talk about when it comes to games. The gameplay itself, specifically classes and their identity in this case. Classes in Final Fantasy XIV all are meant to serve a unique role in player experience to fit your wants or needs of your group of friends, raiders, whatever the case may be. Want to hit enemies with extremely powerful but slower attacks? Samurai and Black Mage should fit well to you. Or if you want the opposite of that and want to hit enemies for a lot of smaller hits that all add up really fast, Monk or Summoner would fit your needs. There's more nuance in these choices obviously, like Summoners having the ability to shield and revive allies, or Monk's ability to dash to allies, making for quick saves in a tight situation. But for the most part, every class has their role within their role, so to speak. Where they're all meant to be valid but different options for that slot in your party. The issues come when you get into the extra nuance though. As over the course of Shadowbringers and Endwalker, these differences have been slowly but surely chipped away, making all the different classes at any given role very similar to one another. A perfect example of this in practice is comparing Warriors and Dark Knights, which are both in the tanking role. Back in Stormblood, these two classes couldn't be further apart. Dark Knight had various different mechanics and abilities that revolved around mana, either consuming it or gaining it, for the sake of building up a meter to use your strong abilities like Bloodspiller and Delirium. Bloodspiller was your strongest attack, having a comparably high potency of 380. Which went up to 650 if you had your tank and DPS stances on at the same time, meaning you were rewarded damage for being the main tank. Delirium was a spell that gave back mana on a cooldown, which specifically gave enough for you to use Dark Arts, a separate ability that increased the potency of various moves like your off globals or main combo, and giving them extra effects in some cases. Dark Knight back then was a very different beast compared to today, having many complexities and interesting mechanics that made you feel smart for learning how to use them efficiently. Nowadays though, Dark Knight is not even remotely similar. All the names for the abilities are there, but they perform very similarly to Warriors now. These ones are less egregious because every class needs them, but you have your base combos, your 2-part AoE combo, and your gauge spending big attacks, both AoE and single target variants. Part of this that makes this very noticeable is Delirium, which used to give you back mana, now will let you use Bloodspiller or Quietus for free 3 times, which may sound familiar if you know anything about Warrior, because of the exact same thing as Enter Release, minus the guaranteed crit and direct hit. But if you close your eyes, does it almost feel like... So instead of engaging in fun gameplay revolving around mana control, you now have the Diet Warrior, who still uses mana to be fair for a solid 3 abilities that take no real understanding or thought to use outside of the occasional Blackest Night for a raid or trial setting. Things like this have happened all throughout the game too. Monks are a good example of being dumbed down to an extreme degree. Going from one of the hardest classes to master and get the most out of, to being by far one of the easiest where you can just walk up to enemies and punch them, no real thought needed for solid DPS. Monks used to have a mechanic called Greased Lightning, which you gained from doing final hits of your combos, and what it would do was it would increase your auto attack speed and reduce the time in between your abilities for each stack, which you could get up to 3. Unless you were in Fists of Wind, which was a stance that monks had prior to Endwalker that had increased movement speed, and at a certain level would unlock a 4 stack of Greased Lightning. Monks also had the most positionals by far in the game. All 6 of their core attacks had a positional, as opposed to the 2 they have now. And you had workarounds for these positionals and your stances with perfect balance and Riddle of Earth. The former being something you'd activate that let you ignore stances, letting you use any part of your main combo for 6 attacks, and the latter being an ability that reduced damage for a time. And if you took damage while it was up, you'd gain a buff that let you ignore positionals for some times afterward. Both of these mechanics made for an interesting dance that you kind of had to play with each fight, where you had to make sure that you got your positionals when you could, or use an ability to make sure that you didn't have to do them, but you wanted to save them to make sure that you could use them when you needed them most. Made for a very fun and interesting gameplay and felt very satisfying when you finally started to understand something on a fight-per-fight basis. Monk is by far the most obvious example of a class being simplified to an extreme. But this is happening across the whole game slowly but surely, classes becoming easier and less diverse from one another. Monk nowadays still has faster auto attacks and cooldowns between abilities, sure, but you don't have to work for it. You just hit a certain level and suddenly you get a boost permanently. The positionals are only on your final attacks now, and the abilities centered around making positionals easier to work around are now just damage reduction and healing for Riddle of Earth, and Perfect Balance now lets you gain chakras from your main combo in any order you choose, and after gaining 3 you do a big AoE for a high amount of damage. Let's just ignore that 2 of these abilities are just abilities that they took from Monk's kit before to show to this new mechanic.
Elixir Field and Tornado Kick.
Yoshi P.
This is the 7th week in a row you've shown up.
Elixir Field and Tornado Kick.
Neither of these changes feel fun though. The chakra mechanic is very easy to do, and if you mess it up you're likely just not paying attention to the game at all, to be honest. And the permanent buffs don't feel rewarding or challenging to gain, you just sort of get them at a certain point and move on like nothing changed. MMOs strive on keeping players invested through whatever means they can, and a large part of that in Final Fantasy's case was its ability to make you feel competent and good for playing your class well. No matter how complicated or crazy it was satisfying using those complex abilities well while in a difficult setting for your skill level. World of Warcraft Classic captured another way that MMOs can do this, with the classes themselves being very easy. Let's not kid ourselves, you just press a button and sort of stand there. But the enemies and environments were hard and challenging, and if you pulled multiple enemies in most scenarios you were just dead. There was no doubt about that. WoW was able to get away with its classes being simple and easy to play because the enemies around you made up for that lack of difficulty. But as we'll discuss next, Final Fantasy XIV is starting to fall a bit shorter in that aspect too, with its bosses and enemy design missing the mark more frequently than it has before. Bosses in Final Fantasy have always been some of the highlights of their games, giving a climax to a character or even a place's story arc, or just being a great spectacle for all to enjoy. Final Fantasy XIV is no exception to this rule, having some gorgeous boss fights with amazing soundtracks that attracted me to play the game to start with. Songs like Titan's Final Phase, or the initial Knights of the Round theme, are just amazing for their own completely separate reasons. And there's plenty more amazing boss fights that I could gush about for hours on their depth, gameplay wise, and their soundtracks that make you remember them. But for all of these boss fights that I remember so fondly, why is it that lately more of them sort of fallen flat to me? These fights that should be way more grandiose and amazing compared to a giant rock or a big knight just don't feel the same to me.
You'll die this day, dragon!
Why is that I remember fighting these smaller fights in terms of scale and also difficulty? Why does Titan's bomb boulders stick out way more than Zodiark's spinning the arena or whatever the fuck you want to call it? A major reason for this in my mind is the lack of originality when you do these fights at a higher level. As these fights happen, certain terms are made for certain mechanics, and it feels as though those terms are used a lot more often than they used to be. 2 perfect examples of this are limit cut and clock positions, and the latter isn't really a mechanic, but it'll make sense in a minute. Limit cut being a mechanic originating back in the Alexander raids, specifically A11S released in September of 2016, where you fight Cruise Chaser. The mechanic in question would have numbered dots appear over every party member's head, and depending on if it were odd or even, would determine what attack you would get and how you'd have to respond, with odd numbers getting a large cleave and even numbers getting an AoE dash. Then it'd repeat until all 8 party members received their respective attack.
This was actually important, just give me a minute.
This mechanic has since been used 2 more times in a very similar fashion. The first major example is the Epic of Alexander, an ultimate fight where you refight the major bosses of the Alexander raid, so it makes sense for the mechanic to come back here, but I figured I'd bring it up anyway. The issue to me comes from the second source, in the first tier of the newest raid in Endwalker, Asphodeus. Well, stop me if this starts sounding familiar. During the second fight of the tier, there comes a mechanic where each party member gains a mark over their head, signifying a number, and based off if you are blue or purple is what mechanic you'll be getting. If you're blue, you'll have the boss's body dash at you, and if you're purple, you'll have the head slam on you in an AoE. At least this time it's based on color instead of if you're odd or even. If you ignore that, based on what color you get, you'll be resolving it if you're odd or even. The reason why I bring up Limit Cut specifically is because it's a pretty complex mechanic overall, and it's a memorable part of Cruise Chaser's fight, so much so they brought it back for his return in the Ultimate fight. The other example of this is much more repetitive and obvious though, the clock mechanic. What this is referring to is the party members getting into positions around the boss in a circle resembling a clock, usually with a tank at 12 and 6, and a healer at 3 and 9 respectively. This positioning usually happens with the boss hitting every party member with a cone that will apply a vulnerability when you're hit. And if you get hit by 2, you'll die and probably take somebody else with you. This mechanic pops up a lot too. It isn't that outrageous to assume you'll be doing this mechanic in every other fight you do, sometimes back to back. In the latest raid tier, this mechanic is used in 3 of the 4 fights. One fight in the entire tier doesn't have a clock mechanic in it, somewhere. All of that to say that Final Fantasy XIV's boss design has turned into a lot of filler mechanics, so to speak. With a lot of simple or repeated mechanics like clock positions, Shiva mechanic, the staples like raid wides and tank busters. All for 1 or 2 mechanics to be the theme of the fight, so to speak, that you'll be seeing multiple times throughout it. What I mean by their theme is the boss doing a specific action with a twist to it. Maybe the boss will cleave to the left of him, but you didn't look at his shadow and he's actually cleaving in front of him.
What the dog doing?
Or maybe the boss is going to do a donut AoE around him, but you didn't look at his little chain weapon to see that he's actually doing a small AoE around him instead. It just gets very repetitive to see the same bag of tricks be thrown at a boss, add some genuinely good music and artwork, and then call it a day. It just feels so wasteful. Much as people probably shit on the older raids like Alexander or even Stormblood, at least those fights didn't feel as formulaic. Alexander had you do some fun and crazy stuff that we never see again, like taking a DPS away to fight an ad by themselves, or having a party member have to get into a little tank to resolve a mechanic. Or even going back in time to save yourself from dying by enemies that are also going back in time to try and kill you in the story. Or where you fought familiar faces across the Final Fantasy games and Omega with faces like Kefka and Chaos showing up, with their own fun mechanics and personality that fit them perfectly, like Kefka dropping pans on your head. Another aspect for why the more recent fights may feel like they fall short is probably to do with the game's story, which is deeply engrossing and honestly felt amazing in Shadowbringers, making everything happening have weight and really have you engrossed in the story of not only your own character and your group of friends, but even the antagonists and their reason for existing. It made you sympathize for them even though you were at odds with them the entire time. Needless to say, this next section is going to contain story spoilers for the latest expansion up to a point. If you haven't finished it or don't want to be spoiled, skip to here of the video. I personally haven't done anything past the main final boss's story, so I can't and won't really be referring to that with this section. The focus is going to be on the main story of Endwalker, ending with the End Singer trial and a little wrap-up after it. I'll start with the things I do like about the story though. Going into the expansion, I was definitely skeptical about Xenos and his reintroduction into the story. They felt a little weird and ultimately pointless at the time, but I'm more than happy to admit that I was completely wrong about that. Xenos, in my opinion, is the best part of Endwalker's story. They do a really good job of driving home his purpose and motivation, while not having him around too much to where he becomes overbearing or annoying. He's also a very good anti-hero towards the end, being the main reason you win against Medion to start with. And as soon as the main threat is dealt with, he goes right back to what he wanted most. A good challenge for himself that only you can provide for him. And he gets story the exact way he would have wanted, dying in combat to the one person to ever impress him. Thavnir as a whole is easily the best zone in the expansion too, with many characters that you quickly grow fond of and watch as they progress through their own character arcs, even if they aren't huge compared to the universe-ending threat happening around them. Speaking of which, this expansion sees us killing off some of the major players that we've heard about for every expansion story up until this point. Killing the strongest beings known in the universe and besting a creature known to be leagues above even them like they were Titan or Ifrit all over again. Entities like Zodiark and Hydaelyn, who have been known as the strongest beings around, are now gone, leaving Final Fantasy XIV in a weird spot of how to give antagonists in the future weight or meaning without them being measuring sticks for these two. In my mind, it's similar to World of Warcraft and its Legion expansion, where you fight alongside and kill the game's versions of gods, using these powerful artifacts from around the game that have been taught about since the game's creation and even before that back when it was an RTS. And afterwards, going back to the fighting each other as the main plot point for the next expansion and having trouble fighting giant bees just felt off.
Not the bees! Not the bees! Ah! Open my eyes!
Part of me feels like Final Fantasy might run into the same issue, but I trust the writers behind Final Fantasy XIV's story a whole lot more than WoW's, to be honest. The main issue with Endwalker's story in my mind though is the final zone of the main story, Ultima Thule. Ultima Thule is all about Dynamis, which is essentially power through emotion, and you see multiple extinct races that come back into existence as shades through your friends sacrificing themselves to see the rest of your group succeed in stopping Medion. This happens throughout the whole zone, where you first enter the zone with 8 people including yourself, all the way up to the end where it's just you facing down the end singer. The major gripe I have with this though is that it's played up so much and feels so forced that if you're even slightly cynical or critical of the story as you watch it, you'll instantly know after the second time this happens that it's not going to be permanent. That they'll all be brought back through the power of emotion or whatever you want to call it. And then that's exactly what happens at the end. Everyone gets brought back through the power of emotion. It really takes the wind out of the story's sails and breaks any sort of tension or emotion that you may have had with the story up to this point. To clarify though, this isn't how everybody feels. In fact, I'd go as far as to say it's probably a take that only a very specific group of people have. But I can't help but feel like it taints the whole zone that handles most other aspects of itself well enough. The atmosphere of the zone as a whole is very well done, with there being no background music while you travel, and the races that are manifested are interesting and bring up genuinely thought-provoking questions. It's just a shame that throughout the entire zone it's broken up by the way, these other races died off, but you've got the MacGuffin, so you're fine. Go get him, little superhero! It's a shame that this is what I walked away from Endwalker's story with, because outside of this zone and kind of the moon, I just wasn't really a big fan of bunnies, but that's probably a me thing. I genuinely enjoy the characters and the arcs that we see play out throughout this expansion. The idea of Dynamis and its abilities is interesting and gives answer to what limit breaks are, which is fascinating, makes you wonder what else can be done with it. But its first major outing in Ultimate Thule with the rather obvious plot devices doesn't fill me with much hope for it moving forward, although I'd be happy to be proven wrong. Endwalker's story felt like it played with very interesting ideas but fell short when it came to executing on those ideas, and I'd say this combined with the core gameplay loop of Endgame made for an environment where people lost interest. But let me explain what I mean by that gameplay loop. Once you reach the end of the current story in Final Fantasy XIV, no matter when you do, it will always follow the same few things that you can do, with the list getting increasingly shorter as you play. You have 1 to 2 new tomestones that you'll use to buy various items. There's one type that will be uncapped that you can get from just about anything at max level that normally give you experience, which you'll mainly use for crafting ingredients or some weaker gear if you really need it. Then there's tomestones with a weekly cap, which you get from raids weekly, roulettes daily, and some other scattered spots that don't give enough to really be worth doing it just for them. These tomestones get you the highest level of gear in the game, only beaten by raid gear sometimes based on the stats your class needs, or if an ultimate happens to come out during that patch, that'll also be better for the weapon. This is where I personally start to take issue with this system, is that this formula is used throughout the whole game, every expansion followed to a T. There will be 4 different tomestones in an expansion's life cycle, and once a new patch or 2 comes out in between one another, that last tomestone is relegated to the uncapped spot, and the one that was in the uncapped spot is removed, and has to be turned in for the tomestones used for everything else in the game. There's no story or fun to be had when it comes to getting good gear, it's just get on, do some dungeons and raids you've already done 47 times to get your tomestones, come back tomorrow to do it again. Get on, do some dungeons and raids you've already done 47 times to get your tomestones, come back tomorrow to do it again. Get on, do some dungeons and raids you've already done 47 times to get your tomestones, come back tomorrow to do it again. Get on, do some dungeons and raids you've already done 47 times to get your tomestones, come back tomorrow to do it again. Then finally you get a piece of gear depending on what you're going for, or you'll cap for the week. See you next Tuesday to do it all again. Why do modern MMOs hate letting their content live on its own? Not to some kind of life support system that they put on roulettes or a dungeon finder or whatever it may be for the game. Why is it that raid tier is the best of the best one patch and then next is thrown out the window for the new shiny one? There's literally no point in doing the last tier unless you really want that mount. But good luck finding a group of people who want to help you learn how to clear it now that it's irrelevant to gear. It makes it so easy to just shit out content that's a template of the old with some new sprinkled in to keep it just different enough to try and make you not notice it. But it wears on you for doing it for years. Do the same exact cycle over and over for some patches and it all just blends together as a big hamster wheel that you're on for each patch. Some of the content and raids are genuinely really interesting with their mechanics. Not the ones taken from previous fights, mind you. And are experiences that I'd love for other players to enjoy, but now it's irrelevant and will only ever be experienced the same way by people who choose to sink to the level of the content to clear it. And even then the classes are going to be fundamentally different, so it won't even be the same as it was back then. But I'm starting to go off on a tangent. Let's wrap this up now. Final Fantasy XIV has the potential and probably still is the best MMO in the genre. I don't want any of this to be taken as I hate the game and I'll never play it again, or that I think it's going to continue to get worse as time goes on. It just saddens me to see the game going down this road of never really reaching much further than it has before, staying in its safe box and releasing content that's very similar to the form, while squeezing all the classes together to make them all feel relatively samey and not unique. It's perfectly fine if Samurai or Blight Mage have the highest DPS in a raid. They're meant to be the hard-hitting, greedy DPS of their roles. So why are other classes so often taking their spots, coming from someone who doesn't even enjoy either of them? Overall, I want Final Fantasy XIV to succeed, and I want to see it stay comfortably at the top. It deserves it for its wonderful story and world that I think everybody watching this video to this point loves and wants to see flourish. I just don't think this is the road that's going to lead them to that spot. Hey, thanks for watching this semi-rant. I hope you enjoyed it or you got to thinking about MMOs or Final Fantasy XIV or whatever it may be. If you disagree with me about anything or want to have a discussion about anything involving the game, feel free to comment or find some other way to reach out to me. Make sure to dry your hands before you clean your room, and I'll see you in the next one. Maybe. If there is a next one. Probably will be. Goodbye.